and hello, audience. Sorry, we had a few first minutes with a lot of noise, but now it seems to be working well. So, welcome to this panel. This is a panel on the proposed AI regulation and the interplay interaction with GDPR and data protection rules. So, my name is Rosa Barceló. I am a partner specialized on data protection working at the Squire Patent Box here in Brussels. And I have the pleasure to moderate today's panel. This panel is organized by the International Institute of Communications. So for those who don't know, is a policy international body that puts together stakeholders with regulators and policymakers to debate questions like today. And there is general events and regional ones. This is called the Brussels Chapter. So in this Brussels Chapter, as I say, we are going to look into the AI regulation and on the GDPR. Now, the reason why we have selected this topic is because AI systems depend, some of them on data and some of them on personal data, so rely on personal data. And the GDPR applies to this collection of personal data. So the AI regulation will come on top. In some cases will complement the GDPR, so add additional requirements. In other cases will specify, will be lex specialis, establishing how the GDPR applies in this particular sector. It does much less the second, more the first one. But so because of this interplay, obviously it causes very interesting questions that this panel will debate today. So the panel is an excellent panel with good friends specialized on data protection, some real people who have very deep knowledge. So I would like to introduce them to you. I will start with companies and then I will move to the institutions and bodies and authorities. So here, I'm not sure if everybody sees people in the same, so I'm not going to say left or right. So, but companies, we have in alphabetical order, Cecilia Alvarez, who is EMEA Privacy Policy Director at Facebook. Then Cornelia Kutterer, who is Senior Director responsible for technology, tech, competition, etc. at Microsoft. Where is Cornelia? Yeah, hi there. Okay, then we have Elena Koning, who is Assistant General Counsel, Global Privacy Compliance and DPO of MasterCard. And then Laura Sediti, who is Head of Public Policy at Snapchat. So these are for companies, and now we look at regulators, and we start with the Commission, with Jordanka Ivanova, who is at DG Connect in the European Commission, the unit responsible for this proposal, and she's legal officer. Hi, Jordanka. And then we have at the EDPS, Anna Bukta, who is head of unit in the unit policy and consultation. And then last but not least, we have Hilke Hiemens. Hi, Hilke, who is the chairman of the litigation chamber at the Belgian Data Protection Authority. So in addition to that, I know that in this room, we have clients and who and are following this topic very closely from different angles. We have also colleagues from our public policy department here at the Squire and colleagues at the data privacy group. So everybody is very excited about this panel. So without further ado, I think that I would like just to say quickly a few logistic questions. So we have, as you can see, 7 speakers and we have 2 hours. So is not a lot of time. So what we thought is that we would we have divided this panel in rounds that touch on topics. We start by general topics, and then we will move to more specific ones. Now, because we don't have a lot of time, we thought that if you have questions for each round, please formulate the questions in writing. Time permitting, we will pick up 1, 2, 3, depends of how we see, and rather than taking them orally, unless we see that we go very fast, and then maybe we can allow a little bit of time for oral. But in principle, in writing, please. So without further ado, I think that we will now start with our first set of themes, and we start, as I said, with the general theme, with Jordanka, who will give a bit of the lay of the land of this proposal for a regulation. It's very, very long. How many articles? 85 articles, 89 recitals. Is really a masterpiece. So it will be good to hear from her a bit the basics of the proposal, how the interplay with the GDPR goes, and the state of play, because the Commission adopted in April. So now it has moved already through the legislative process, but to hear from you, where are you exactly and what is ahead of us? So I think, Jordanka, if you want, the floor is yours. I think Anya is preparing the presentation that you sent us.
Thank you so much, Rosa, for this invitation and for organizing this debate, which is indeed very important, how the proposed AI Act will intersect with our existing very robust legal framework on data protection. So very pleased to be here and to discuss with all these distinguished experts from business, other institutions as well, how we actually ensure that, especially also in the ongoing legislative process. So if we move to the next slide, I will indeed here only focus on the really short introduction without going to some further details and how in the end this intersects with the GDPR, but just want to emphasize again that we are not starting from scratch in regulating artificial intelligence, and we all know that we have robust existing legislation, including data protection, that applies certainly to automated decision making, and this certainly includes as well the artificial intelligence technology, which is more advanced in this sense. So what we've been really trying is really to fill already existing gaps and make sure that also all our rights that are already granted under the EU Charter and also under sectoral EU legislation are effective, and we can cope sufficiently with the specific risks and challenges that AI technology, in terms of its opacity, complexity, bias dependency, brings to all this landscape. So this is, of course, the result of a very long process. We've started more than 3 years ago. It's been a long involvement and discussions with many experts, stakeholders as well. So I just want to highlight that we've been really building on a very solid basis when proposing this legislation in April this year. So some of the key principles of the approach is that we are coming here with a horizontal approach, and we directly propose a regulation, which is quite important. It sets uniform rules that will be applicable for AI across the whole European AI market. This is key for us also to ensure this uniform understanding, common single market, and also to give sufficient legal certainty how those rules should be applicable, and we should avoid market fragmentation. So we are also dealing here with the technology that we are trying to cover from the market perspective, the host cycle, including the placing on the market, also putting into service and use of those AI systems. So often, as you know, in the existing fundamental rights legislation, Because of the limitations of the personal scope, we might not always cover those manufacturers who are designing and developing those technologies. So here we are trying also to build that gap and make sure that we already have these considerations and risk mitigations before the systems are placed on the market, but also throughout the whole cycle, including their use. And we aim to ensure two main objectives. So first, as is the focus of this legislation, we try to address the risks to safety and fundamental rights. We want to ensure this human centricity and trustworthiness of AI technology because we think that this is essential. We need all these benefits to be made available for citizens. It is really important that this respects our fundamental rights. It's also safe for users. And we also aim at the same time through these common requirements and common rules, create this single market for trustworthy AI in Europe. We should enable innovation and also encourage the development and uptake of this technology for the common good. So another very important principle, as mentioned in the beginning, we are not starting from scratch. So we have a very delicate and actually complex existing legislation in Europe, be it for the way products are designed and marketed, or how our fundamental rights should be respected, including for the GDPR. So it's been really important to ensure this consistency and complementarity with that existing framework. I also want to emphasize already now, and I'll talk more afterwards, that we are just complementing and our proposal is mentioned by Rosa on the top of already what we have as existing legislation. And it is without prejudice to all the rules that are under GDPR and the Law Enforcement Directive. So I'll talk a bit more in later, but just another high-level principle that we've tried to follow is really to ensure this trust and build trust in the technology. And we've here try to propose this certification process, building on the success of the internal market rules. So we really think that it's important already before the systems are placed on the EU market, so that they are checked and there are certain requirements that they should fulfill. And then users may be more confident, and they can also take more information and be informed and enabled to comply with also their existing obligations. We've also tried to follow this important risk-based approach because it's key that this is a very diverse transversal technology with numerous applications. We really have to remain proportionate and design the rules that should are strictly needed to address specific applications of the technology and not go beyond so as to not hamper innovation and the benefits. And we are also trying to create this level playing field because these are rules that are going to be applicable in the same way to both actors and providers who are placing those systems in the EU, irrespective of whether they come from Europe or outside. If we move to the next slide, here you really see the risk-based approach I mentioned, because that is actually a central piece for the regulation. And also I think there is a emerging common agreement across all countries also in the world that we have to deal with AI based exactly on this risk-based approach to remain proportionate. And here you see the famous pyramid, probably you've seen it many times, but you see that we've tried to cover specific use cases and then adapt the rules according to the risks to health and safety and their stringency. So on the lowest level, you see all these applications where we think that they are not directly covered by the regulation because they are not posing significant risks to fundamental rights and safety, so they will not be directly regulated. They can be admitted to the market, but of course, because we want to encourage this trustworthy AI culture, they are also free to adhere to voluntary codes of conduct. Then we have and this actually it's a category that is much broader than just that level layer as shown here. Then we have the yellow category where we have systems with specific transparency obligations, where we think people should be informed. For example, when they're interacting with AI systems, so they are not misled when emotion recognition systems are used or deepfake. So these are really rules that are complementary to already what we have as information obligations, including under GDPR, consumer protection, and others. And then with the next two categories, we actually move to the core of the AI proposal, and first starting with the high-risk category, where we envisage that those systems they are not prohibited, and it's a bit maybe misleading, the use of high risk. They are not prohibited as such, but they should be subjected to specific requirements and also ex ante and ex post procedures. And here, if we move to the next slide, you see a bit that we've already tried to provide this legal certainty for operators, what would be actually covered, so they are not left, all of them now, on their own when determining whether they would be high risk and have to comply with the legislation. So we cover two main categories: AI systems that are safety components of regulated products like medical device, and those should be subject to third-party conformity assessment. We are fully integrating the system into the existing product safety legislation. And we are trying to regulate with this internal market legislation also for first-time systems, the so-called standalone AI systems that are primarily with fundamental rights implications. And here you see some of the broad categories where we propose very specific use cases for biometric identification, management of critical infrastructure, education, employment, access to public and private services, law enforcement, migration, and others. So these are really use cases that are explicitly proposed and defined in the regulation within those broad categories. And we think to remain the regulation future-proof, we should be able also to adapt the list over time. On the next slide, you see what are the key requirements that we expect those systems to fulfill before they are placed on the market. So we place those obligations on the providers who are designing those systems. So we should really take into account and mitigate to the extent possible the risks to fundamental rights and safety already before they are really placed, because we know that some risks afterwards cannot be even properly corrected. And here we're building a lot on the high-level expert group work, and it's quite recognized as good practices requirements. We propose that those systems should be built with high-quality data, is because we know that AI is as good as the system and the data it's built on. So indeed, here we could have overlap if this personal data is fed into the system where GDPR would also apply. But we could have, of course, systems that are based on non-personal or synthetic data, where we think in any case that that data should be relevant, representative, and we impose also requirements for certain good data governance and management procedures, including the proper examination of biases, data checks, etc. Next, we also require the technical documentation and some traceability of the system, also some transparency of the functioning of the system itself. So its output is interpretable by users, and also specific information that users should obtain from the provider with the instructions of use on the limitations and capabilities of the system. Human oversight is a key requirement because we think this is indeed AI should be a tool, and we should really ensure that humans remain in control, and they are, especially for fundamental rights considerations, important mechanisms that should be built already in the system, but also exercised by user while they're using those systems. And then, quite importantly, also the requirement for robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. All that also underpinned with the general obligation for risk management, because the provider should already anticipate the risk and try to mitigate them. So on the next slide, I just want to a bit highlight, because of course with data protection, we have clear links, and we're wondering how actually this product safety legislation is helping us to preserve and protect fundamental rights. So it's indeed a novelty, maybe, and it's the first time where you see such an approach, but I just want to highlight some of the real practical obligations, how that should work in practice, and throughout the whole life cycle of the AI system, that risks to fundamental rights are properly assessed and mitigated. So first, you see, as I mentioned, there is an obligation for the provider to assess and mitigate foreseeable risks, including risks to fundamental rights, in view also of the intended purpose of the system. So this is a process they should already start while they're designing, but also throughout the whole life cycle. They should also ensure conformity with the requirements I mentioned before, building also on the risk assessment. And this is a key step before they can place their product system on the market or put it into service if they are developing it in-house. So then they can ensure that this product is compliant. They will also be obliged for applications with the standalone AI systems are mentioned for fundamental rights considerations to register that system in a publicly wide register. And they will also then have to inform and provide users with all the appropriate information about the limitations, the risks, the appropriate instructions, how he should use the system, so those risks are mitigated also while he is operating. Of course, then the obligations come also for the users, who we should not forget continues to have to comply with all the existing data protection law, but also non-discrimination and consumer protection and all the existing safeguards we have. But on the top of that, you also have to follow these instructions of use, also exercise this effective human oversight and monitor for risks. And in case those risks arise, he should also promptly inform the provider, so then he can take that mitigating measure. So you already see that while we cover also the use, we also consider, in case of accidents, obligations for flow of information, for corrective actions by the provider themselves in their post-market monitoring systems, reporting obligations for market surveillance and other authorities, that in the end should really enable also affected people to preserve their rights and exercise the available safeguards we have. And all of that, of course, you see that in the center of all this, we have the affected people whose rights should be taken into account, risks to them mitigated, and in case there are any harms, because we can never prevent from the start 100% the harm, they should have the effective protection guaranteed by law. So on the next slide, you see also the final pyramid, and this is the prohibited AI practices. We propose that we think it's really important also to set clear limits on the AI what kind of AI we don't want to see in Europe. And here you see 4 prohibited practices broadly covering subliminal manipulation, exploitation of vulnerabilities, social scoring by public authorities, and also real-time remote biometric identification for law enforcement public purposes in publicly accessible spaces. We really aim with this to ensure that misuse of AI is not possible in Europe. We've also tried at the same time to remain deliberately narrow in the way they are phrased, so we keep the proportionality, and we also don't hinder innovation, while at the same time also taking into account that there are already many existing prohibitions also in existing legislation, including consumer protection, non-discrimination, but of course also the data protection legislation and the GDPR. So that's why, for example, if you don't see here prohibition for private actors of remote biometric identification, it's because it's already prohibited under GDPR Article 9. So on the next slide, I'm not going to talk about the governance and the rest, but just want to finally focus a bit on the link with the data protection. You see that, as mentioned, this is AI Act is only one puzzle among many other existing legislation. We have to make this legislation really consistent and working in practice, and also not create overlaps or hinder in any case the effective enforcement of already what we have as legal frameworks. So with this, we really aim to cover this comprehensive regulatory approach to AI, and it is not only the AI Act that applies to AI. I just want to reinforce that point again. And many of the problems might have been also already covered by other acts. So on the next slide, just finally on the link with the relationship with the GDPR, I want to say again that this is legislation that is complementary to the existing data protection legislation. We will have both legal frameworks applicable at the same time. So our legislation kicks in earlier in the stage because it could cover also manufacturers of systems that might not be really data controllers. It covers also AI systems that might not be at all processing personal data, but that might still cause risks to fundamental rights. While of course we should keep in mind that the GDPR and the law enforcement directive continues to apply always when personal data is processed, and all the rights and obligations there continue to exist. On the question whether the AI Act is lex specialis to GDPR, no, it is not, exactly because they apply at the same time. The only provision where we conceive that the AI Act is lex specialis, this is Article 5.1d, and this is the prohibition of real-time remote biometric identification for law enforcement purposes, which is lex specialis of Article 10 of the LED directive, because with this act, we already envisage in this union legislation that there are additional conditions and requirements that should be in place for such use to be allowed. And also we are complementing with some additional transparency obligations that might not already be applicable under the data protection legislation, for example, where people should be informed when they are interacting with AI systems. Now, saying that it is also important to keep in mind that if a product is certified under the AI Act because it can be placed on the market, that does not mean that its use is compatible with EU law, including data protection legislation. So the AI Act as a principle does not provide the legal basis for the use of those systems. Of course, the user should always have that at place. We have only two exceptions where we envisage that this is already possible to process personal data on the basis of the Act. This is Article 10.5, which is the processing of special categories of personal data for bias monitoring and correction, because we've seen some problems for companies actually and legal uncertainty whether they can, under the prohibitions of Article 9 of the GDPR, really process these sensitive categories in order that are needed to detect biases in the systems. And we say that this is possible and in line also with the exceptions in the GDPR, also subject to specific safeguards that we propose there. And also the other exception is Article 54, which is linked to the further processing of personal data in the regulatory sandboxes, which is very strictly limited only for the development of specific AI systems in the public interest, and also subject to very strong and specific safeguards. Final point, a bit about I'm sure we'll discuss the governance, but just here to say that in terms of the involvement of the data protection authorities, we have given freedom to member states to decide who should be the competent authority supervising the AI Act enforcement. And of course, they can choose to designate the data protection authorities to do that. But we are not prescribing, as we think this is also part of the subsidiarity principles and can depend on the capabilities and the decisions in the member states. So however, I want to emphasize that the existing data protection authorities and also all other authorities that are responsible for enforcement of existing fundamental rights legislation, like consumer protection authorities, equality bodies, and others, they will be actually empowered on the basis of this AI Act, and they will have some very new important rights. For example, they will be able to get direct access to the documentation of the high-risk AI system, and they could then use that for their own purposes for investigations. They could also request testing of the system and team with the market surveillance authorities, so they join forces, they have more technical capacities to do that. And those authorities should also be informed in case of incidents or malfunctionings are reported by providers when it comes to the high-risk AI system. So we really have this cooperation between different authorities, and we have this mechanism for early and effective enforcement. I think I stop maybe just on the end for the timeline, just to say that we are very happy that there is a strong political will to progress on this file, both on the Parliament and the Council side. So we envisage 2 years of transitional period after the regulation is adopted, and at the same time we're working to support the future implementation with harmonized standards that are going to be adopted by European standardization organizations, and that can be really building on the best practices and solutions to help providers comply with their obligations. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I was too long.
It's okay. Jordanka, there is a question as to whether your slides can be provided afterwards. Yes?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for this very, very comprehensive overview of this, the proposal. It has a lot of merit because it's a difficult proposal to chew on with internal market, typical legislation, and then fundamental rights. I guess it's the first time that we see this merging of the two in one proposal. So thank you. Don't go away if it's possible, because you will come back in the next set of themes. So now we move to Cornelia Kutterer and later to Laura Seriti. And what we would like for you, Cornelia, is if you could comment. You have applauded, I believe, the proposal. You are positive, Microsoft is positive, but you have some ideas about how further improve it. And in particular, we thought that it will be good now at this stage of this first round of questions. You could tell us a bit about your views on the high risk, is well calibrated, the topics that are in the high risk, and in the risk approach in general. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rosa. And I will eventually start with the waiver, because what I've learned over the last almost year now since the adoption of the proposal is that in every conversation, I learn something new, because there's such a complexity around this, not only from the technology, from what companies already do, but also like how civil society has perceived the proposal and how it applies to different other stakeholders. So there is a bit of learning, I think, each time we speak about this. I will start eventually just explaining where we are coming from. We've been very engaged in the development over these more than 3 years, I believe now, that the Commission has intensively worked with stakeholders. We've done the deep dive with the high-level group on AI, and we've learned from these processes, in particular also for our own standards that we have developed. And I say standards or policies, these are of course voluntary. They are currently existing in order to operationalize our company's commitment on principles that are fairly similar to what the high-level group on AI came about. When you think about inclusion, fairness, accountability, transparency, and privacy and safety requirements. So since then, since the publication of these principles, we've been internally really working towards, almost in parallel with the Commission, working towards how do you actually operationalize this? What do you tell engineering groups when you tell them, oh, your system has to be accountable, it has to be fair. Fair is in particular a really interesting debate, and I want to talk a little bit about this in the context of the fundamental rights as well. So we have pulled this together. We're really looking at goals that we want to achieve and outcomes and the processes that engineering groups have to sort of follow in order to get there. And the starting point is really, okay, if you want to be accountable, you have to do an impact assessment. And there's already a difference to GDPR, and I'm not going into all these details. But this is really where we are coming from. So this learning and how you're actually doing it in practice throughout the life cycle of an AI system, that our comments in where we believe we need improvements to make it work comes from. We have applauded the Commission. We do believe that it's the right approach to start with high risk scenarios. And when we do the impact assessment, and while we do this sort of generally, when we start thinking about developing an AI system, we think of 3 different categories in terms of sensitive uses. The one is really systems where harm to safety, physical or psychological harm could occur. We think about harms in the context of fundamental rights issues, in particular in the context of surveillance, for example. And then we're thinking about impact or systems that have an impact on people's life. And here you think about loans or judicial decisions, etc. And so this is what we do internally currently on a voluntary basis. But when you compare this with these high-risk scenarios, they're pretty much similar. So I think there is a common understanding in what type of risks need to be dealt with more specifically, and which need some guardrails around them to be mitigated. And then, of course, what is also important in this context is that you have very different ways of mitigating this. And it depends also a little bit on the type of AI system that you're using, where certain mitigation tools might actually be more important than others. What I mean by that is, so you start thinking very early on in what type of risks could occur. What we invite our engineers to think about is very broadly about the stakeholders, not only about the stakeholders they have in mind to support. So it's like, whom do you want to help with this AI system? Who might negatively be impacted by this AI systems? And in having this broader range, and this is eventually already a difference to GDPR, is very individually focused on the data subject. So this is a much broader way of holistically thinking about the benefits. And then you start thinking through mitigations in the life cycle, in the development, in the design, through technology means, through restrictions in the contract, and of course also in indicating how it will be deployed and what the deployer needs to be doing. One example here is to think about, okay, you have human oversight, but of course you need to train the humans also to be able to do this correctly, right? To think also in this type of contexts. So that is sort of where we are coming from, and where we had just from a experience perspective issues where we think it needs absolutely clarifications is so not so much about the categories of the risks that have been identified, much more about who actually at what point in time has to take on these responsibilities. So and I think I need to check a little bit the time because I don't have that much, but the division that is really built on the product safety framework, where you have manufacturers and then you have users, and the manufacturer knows exactly what he's doing, so he gives the instructions to the user, and that's sort of replicated here in the AI Act. Now, Recital 60, for example, talks about component providers, acknowledging that there is plenty of suppliers, if you like, in the value chain, but it talks then about the providers and the users. And then you have Article 16 that will basically, using the word dump the obligations on the provider as it is defined. And the user is just really following the instructions of the provider. And that's sort of the baseline. And we're believing that the baseline is maybe not exactly how the reality works. We are often component providers, sort of almost out of the scope, while we do all of that. So we have a lot of customers that build AI systems based on different components from different companies. There is a lot of AI systems that are based on AI systems that then are fine-tuned by the user, the deployer, with their own data, for example. And of course, you have general purpose AI that can be applied and deployed in many different scenarios. So the relation between 60, 16, 24, and 28 is more confusing than the baseline eventually that the Commission had in mind suggests, and that is one of the core areas that we felt it needs adjustments. Now, it's interesting that the Slovenian presidency has sort of had similar thoughts, in particular when it comes to general AI purpose AI systems, and sort of have taken them out of that with including a new chapter. This is sort of from a company's perspective, looking at the allocation of responsibilities. But there is an additional piece, I think, which is really relevant, and in particular, in relation to your Danka's slide with the impacted user in the middle. The AI system in particular in the context of Annex 3 scenarios are usually used in order to augment human decisions that are made in these contexts. So, for example, in the recruitment context, or for a bank to decide whether there is a loan. And so there is more that the deployer, or the user as it is called in the AI Act, is so much closer to the specific socio context, socio context in this space, that is not taken into account. Also for certain obligations such as transparency or accountability in the full life cycle, I think there the allocation of the responsibilities are not.
Maybe the transparency is going to be addressed later, so I think you will come back as well. So maybe we should.
Oh, now you stopped. So look, I understand you were just cutting off for a second. No, I think that's sort of the first comments, and I hope we can deep dive a little bit more into those aspects. Thanks, Rosa.
Okay, thank you, Cornelia. It was very good summary. Okay, I think that we go to Laura. Laura, how does a snapshot view the proposal?
Thank you, Rosa. Perhaps I was thinking that perhaps by way of introduction, I would also say a few words about Snapchat for those who don't know the company. Just because we were born 10 years ago, and the idea of our founders was basically to develop new ways for people to connect and communicate in an authentic manner. And the focus of our product has always been on privacy, because that's really key to our value proposition, in the sense that we were born as a kind of antidote to traditional social networks. So for this reason, we have invested a lot, and we have privacy embedded in our architecture. And this means that basically all the new features that involve the processing of personal data go through an intense privacy review process. And we have our teams of privacy engineers and privacy lawyers, which basically vet any features before they are released. And so the focus, we're really focused on making sure that we have features which are private by default, and we want to offer easy to use controls to provide basically choices for our users and community. So about the AI Act, we definitely welcome this initiative. And in particular, we like the approach chosen by the Commission to try and ensure balanced and proportionate horizontal coverage, and in particular trying to address the risks and problems linked to the AI, but also without constraining or hindering too much technological development in this important area. We also like the risk-based approach. We think that it strikes a good balance between, again, the let's say competing objectives of promoting the technology while protecting fundamental rights. We think that we would like an angle that perhaps could be further explored when it comes to risk-based approach. To the risk-based approach is probably the distinction between AI systems which work autonomously and those which are semi-autonomous, in the sense that we think that the importance and the impact of human review and controls as a mitigating factor could be better taken into account, so as to ensure a differentiated regulatory approach and ensure a higher proportionality of the measures. And then we think when it comes to the scope of the regulation, we think there could be some additional clarity that would be welcome to basically make sure that the measure targets what we consider to be truly AI, in the sense that we think the focus of the regulation should be more on the systems which have both the ability to process unstructured or uncertain data sets and extract information on that basis. The current definition of AI systems we think it's too broad in the sense that it encompasses basically any data processing system or computing system. And so we think that a way perhaps to strike a better balance would be to focus also on the type of data and the ability of systems to basically process uncertain inputs. And then finally, when it comes to the points of transparency, which for us it's very important, we think that this proposal is a great opportunity because we understand that right now the Commission has focused on, has envisaged certain transparency obligation for certain low risk applications. But we think that more could be done in the sense that we could, this proposal could offer the opportunity to create a cross-industry level playing field on the key principles which could underline the development and use of AI systems. And I will share some additional thoughts later in the discussion. And finally, just in terms of the potential impact of this regulation for companies, again, we see this as a great opportunity to support innovation, and in particular to help unlock the power of data through AI, and to ensure that the legal framework is innovation friendly, which we understood and we heard also from Jordanka is one of the purposes and objectives of the Commission. We believe that there could be space and room to bring additional clarity and to improve legal certainty for operators, especially when it comes to the requirements of the GDPR in the context of AI applications. For instance, we think the new regulation could supplement the GDPR rules by providing clarifications on the required degree of transparency and the legal basis necessary for the purpose of training algorithms. Companies need to be able to train machine learning algorithms to ensure reliability, accuracy, and fairness. But this requires a broad range of data and all types of potential inputs, including possibly personal and sensitive data, which are essential, for instance, to train algorithms to recognize humans. So currently, the GDPR imposes important constraints on the use of such data by requiring explicit consent, even when data are not retained, but for instance, just used to test and train the algorithms. So as such, being cautious in the way companies, so for companies who are cautious in applying the GDPR, this could basically hamper the development of AI and limit their ability basically to exploit or to use data pools which are at their disposal. So we think this is an area where the AI proposal, AI Act, could have a great positive impact on companies and help them basically innovate and better support their customers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this very concise overview of giving your thoughts about where you think that is good and where you think that it could be better. So with that, we now move from this first set of themes, general ones, to the next round. And the next round actually is about, we are going already to the interplay with the GDPR more deeper. And we start with Anna Bukta. And we would like Anna, the EDPS and the EDP board, they have issued a joint opinion on the proposal, with some negative and some positive. I think is a bit of everything. So Anna, if you could focus now on a few aspects, and then we will go into others. But so for now, a bit the interplay with the GDPR, the points that are more GDPR and AI.
Thank you, Rosa, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And as I believe Cornelia mentioned, it's always an opportunity to learn new things and gain new insights, even though the proposal is already, well, almost a year old. And thank you, Rosa, for the invitation also in this Data Protection Week. Normally, we would probably all be meeting during the CPDP conference. This year, no such luck. We have to wait a few more months. but at least we can have a discussion also on GDPR related topics. So indeed, just for context, what we do at the EDPS, we normally issue proposals in response to consultation requests by the Commission. The Commission is obligated to consult us following the pursuant to the EU GDPR, so the regulation which kind of copies and pastes GDPR to a large extent for the EU institutions and bodies. And in some cases where there is a particular impact on the fundamental rights to data protection, the Commission also can consult the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, in which case EDPS and EDPB issue a joint opinion, which is then addressed mainly to the Council and the Parliament, of course, suggesting further improvements to the proposal. And this is what happened also in the case of the AI Act proposal, and the joint opinion was issued in June of last year. So, I will not go into all of the aspects raised there. Especially since you, Rosa, and the previous speakers already alluded a little bit on the interplay and where the challenges lie. I would just like to say that by and large, we have supported the Commission's approach from the very beginning. So both the risk-based approach and to differentiate between the different categories of risks, following from the uses of AI systems and applications. And also we found from the very beginning quite interesting the approach of building on existing regulatory frameworks, on the conformity markings and the product safety, and also relying on existing governance schemes that are already in place. Of course, this proposal has a very broad scope, and so there will be products and there will be systems where we can more easily wrap our heads around how it will fit with the existing product safety rules, for example, and conformity assessment. It might be a little bit more challenging when we think about those systems and applications which actually rely largely on processing of personal data, and where the impacts on the fundamental rights to privacy and data protection, but not exclusively, might be the highest. So all that is very positive. Now I would say that the challenge really is to make sure that the aspirations and the objectives which the Commission set out for this act, and which Jordanka summarized on her slides very nicely, that they are actually reflected in the drafting. And this is, I think, something that, at least from our analysis, we felt that it is not always entirely the case, that, for example, some of the limitations or prohibitions of certain high-risk systems are subject to such conditions as to make them really, really very narrow, far too narrow to be impactful in practice. By contrast, some of the exceptions are phrased in very broad terms, which might not necessarily amount to any limitation at all. But I was very, very happy and intrigued to see also a specific slide now devoted to the interplay with the GDPR. I think there were some elements included there which show an evolution of understanding also on the Commission side of how the things are more complex than they may seem at first sight. And so I'm very happy to see that there is an acknowledgement now that for example in Article 10, I believe 10.5, there is actually a legal basis provided in addition to the ones for sandboxes and the limitations on the remote biometric identification. So I'm very happy. I would prefer, you know, I'm interpreting this as an element of ongoing dialogue, also in response to the points that we have raised in our joint opinion. And so I hope that this we can continue this discussion to get an even better understanding of how the two systems can work together. Rosa, you already started from stating the obvious. Whenever there will be processing of personal data, whether in the context of AI or not, GDPR and also the EU DPR or the law enforcement directive, depending on the context, will continue to apply. And so this will mean that both the general higher level principles, including the requirement to have a legal basis for the processing in the first place, and all the rest will continue to apply, but also the other obligations for controllers and processors and the rights of the data subjects. And here I think we run indeed into maybe the first set of difficulties in that the two acts do not operate with the same taxonomy exactly. So the entity placing an AI system on the market might not necessarily be the controller. It would be in most cases the user who would be the controller. And then obviously data subject and the individuals that are actually impacted by the processing and by the AI powered decisions are to a certain extent, if not entirely, absent from the AI Act, actually. So this is an additional complication. This can have quite practical consequences. And when we think through the different levels and, for example, how the risk assessment will apply in the context of AI Act, and how would that then interplay with a DPIA pursuant to the GDPR, for example, is one question. But also, and I believe one of the previous speakers also alluded to that, simple things such as transparency obligations under the GDPR. If it's not absolutely clear that the provider of the system or a solution is obliged to give to the user all the information that the user will then need in turn to comply with GDPR-based transparency obligations, then in practice there might be a problem. In other words, if I'm a user of an AI product and I get it in a sort of a black box with not much by way of transparency, information that is listed under the transparency obligations under GDPR, which I will have to give to the data subjects, then we have a certain disconnect, and it might be a very practical issue, especially for small and medium enterprises and others who are, smaller players on the markets, may not necessarily have all the resources to get the information or to make their own assessments further down the line. There is also the question of, Jordanka explained it very well, and it's quite clear from the proposal, from the preamble, the fact that the product is assigned a CE marking, conformity marking pursuant to the AI Act is without prejudice, to use the favorite, Brussels phrase, or does not mean in itself that the product or the AI system will be legal to use, will be conform with other requirements, for example, the GDPR, but it may also be other consumer protection rules or other sets of rules, which on the one hand, yes, it makes sense in the abstract. However, I may be wrong, but I don't think that we really have a comparable situation on the market today, in the sense that we don't currently have products which are assigned CE markings while their use may still be illegal. You know what I mean? It may, again, create lack of or undermine legal certainty at the very least, or lead users to believe that they are using systems and products which are completely conform, maybe not entirely realizing that there is a whole bunch of rules, not unimportant ones, which have not been complied with. So we would have, I say we when I mean the EDPS, EDPB, in our joint opinion, we would have preferred that there is a clearer, more direct link between the criteria of conformity assessment under the AI Act and at least certain requirements of the GDPR, of course, to the extent that there is personal data processing taking place in this context in the first place. And let me just finish by more, let's say, systemic and institutional dimension and consideration. The AI Act is quite interesting and intriguing in that indeed it has this dual legal basis. So there is Article 114 and there is also Article 16 of the treaty. And the proposal attempts to quite clearly define or delineate which elements of the AI Act are based on Article 16. I may, again, I don't have a full overview of all European legal proposals currently under consideration or ever adopted, but it is quite a unique situation. Quite often, it can happen that there is more than one legal basis for an act, but then the legislator is hardly ever as specific as here in kind of trying to, limit the parts which are ostensibly based on Article 16. And being based for a legal act to be based on Article 16 of the treaty is not a trivial aspect, because an act which is based on Article 16 basically becomes part of the European generally applicable framework for data protection, data processing, on par with the GDPR, the Law Enforcement Directive, the EU DPR. So let's hope that this delineation, that this limitation becomes meaningful, that it works. But to me, it's still a very open question as to how future jurisprudence, future regulatory practice will actually give meaning to this particular situation and this specific use of Article 16. And also, one of the consequences of a legal act being based on Article 16 is the requirement of independent control, but usually by the Independent Data Protection Authority, because these are typically the ones, the public authorities of the member states or at EU level, which fulfill the high level of independence which is required under the GDPR and under the court's case law.
Anna, you will leave nothing for Hilko. This was his. You can see him. He's going to have.
I'm sorry about that, but you see, we haven't coordinated properly. But anyway, just to say that here also, I probably would slightly disagree with Jordanka that member states may actually have less flexibility when assigning competence, at least for those elements of the proposals which are clearly it's the intention of the regulator to base them on Article 16 of the treaty. But indeed, we can discuss the DPAs and regulators aspects a bit later. So if I just may finish with one more comment, I think bottom line, the proposal is a very good start. But there are some elements which we believe should be and can still be clarified in the legislative process to make sure that, as I mentioned, the ambition which the Commission set out for this proposal are truly fulfilled, and in particular to make sure that the affected people, the data subjects, the individuals that they are truly in the center of the whole complicated system that we are putting in place to safeguard, to promote innovation on the one hand, but also to safeguard fundamental rights on the other hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for unfolding this set of very intricacies about the data privacy aspect. Okay, now, Cecilia, I think that the without prejudice ties very well with the part that you were going to discuss. So the without prejudice, and also about Article 10, the requirements for the data training, data validation, and data testing. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rosa, for the invitation and for being here today with all of you. Before I address the specific element that you were asking me, since there have been a certain number of comments that actually I fully agree as well, and therefore I would like to make a certain remarks without prejudice to what has been said. So, and the comments are not necessarily always linked to the drafting of the original proposal of the Commission. Is really thinking of a legislative process that is just starting to a certain extent, and how we would like probably to have as an output of all of this legislative process. So I think that it has been said, and starting by Jordanka, that the GDPR does not work in isolation, or maybe the AI does not work in isolation. I start with the GDPR because it's definitely the core of my angle when I am addressing this sphere of regulation. And it definitely doesn't work as a plugin. If we believe, as we do, that we should be able to implement the privacy by design principle and technology, we should ensure that we have also a consistent regulatory making process by design as well. And I think that as privacy professionals, we have been how painful it is to work with rules that have been not maybe truly taking into account how to apply GDPR in practice and jointly with another regulation. So the without prejudice to the application of the GDPR has proven many times already that this has not been an effective approach. So I agree with Anna that I have seen in the slides an evolution of what I thought was the starting point with respect to how this has been approached, and I think that this is an excellent result. Without making an exhaustive list, I would like to highlight some aspects of the GDPR that I believe it is worth taking into account when addressing regulation on AI. And again, not necessarily focused on only the original Commission proposal, but in general on where we should probably as a result. So Article 22 of the GDPR touches 4 aspects that I think are relevant for AI. The criteria to identify high risk on individuals, which is something that I think we should have in mind when defining what high risk is, even though the societal harm is something that the GDPR is not taking into account because very much focused on the individual, but definitely the part on the individual is something that I would love to see that there is a full alignment in this respect. The element of the additional information that we believe individuals will will be more relevant for them, such as the existence of the automatic decision, the logic involved, and the consequences for the individual. There is also a call for implementing additional safeguards with sensitive personal data are involved, and the need to ensure human intervention. And in this case, the GDPR is not necessarily looking for the human oversight that the AI proposal is looking at, but rather, I believe, to have a way for individuals to express their point of view, and if applicable, to contest the automatic decision. I am very happy to have seen in the slides the way in which the Commission is now looking at 10.5, because definitely I think that there has been a lot of issues with respect to whether Article 9 was prepared, or the construction of Article 9 was prepared actually to be able to address fairness. So it's very important that there is a clear legal basis that this is something that can be used and should be used actually in order to be effective in addressing non-discrimination or bias. Regarding the risk assessment, I will join here Anna's comments with respect to the need of seeing how this is going to be integrated. So the data protection impact assessment is a process that is defined in the GDPR and also construed by the data protection authorities. And if we need to have an AI impact assessment, these two processes need to be able to speak together, because at the end of the day, it would probably be the same persons also who are going to deal with these kind of processes. And therefore, this is something that we need to ensure consistency. And it is not clear, at least in my reading, with respect to the AI regulation. In certain articles, I think that there is a focus on the technology itself, and in others, there is a focus on the product that involves AI. And this is not the same thing with respect to the subject matter or where the risk assessment needs to be done. Regarding research, I take here not the original proposal, but the Slovenian compromise text. And I have seen a very interesting exception regarding research, which I think is something that is relevant for the ambition of Europe, and also for claims that we have had, I think, in the research community regarding GDPR. So if we believe that it is appropriate, that there is an exemption for research in the AI regulation, then we need to understand how it works with GDPR. Because if we do not remove the research barriers that exist or that are perceived to exist in the letter of GDPR or its construction, this is something that is not going to work properly. So I believe that this is an area in which we have room for improvement. Regarding the enforcement and liability, I also believe that it is not clear the taxonomy of users and which of them match or not with the concept of controller or joint controller. And this is an issue that I have seen in many other regulations, that when this is not clear, it is very difficult in terms of how the organizations are able to implement the regulations, but also in terms of the DPAs being able also to do an enforcement that makes sense, at least from the side of the data protection, but also from the sake of the harmonization. If we are looking to have a single market, we cannot leave these kind of things open. And in particular, with this kind of endless expansion of the joint controllership notion, it will be becoming even more difficult, thinking of how these users is like a kind of chain of users. And therefore, this is something that I believe we need to pay more attention. And regarding the enforcement side, I think that it is also relevant to see how we are going to end up with respect to the best enforcement possible, in the sense of being able to combine expertise on AI, to combine harmonization, and to combine also that we are not putting organization in situations of non-bis in idem. And I think that these three goals is something that we need to take into account in how we believe the architecture of enforcement should work. And moving to the specific question that Rosa has been posing to me, I think that I've seen in the slides that there was a focus on the fact that the data set should be relevant and representative, but the issue that I would like to raise is not with relevant and representative, but with the part that was not in the slide, free of errors and complete. And I think that it is unclear how this mandate will achieve the alleged goal in order to ensure that the high-risk AI is unbiased, at least for the following main three reasons. One is that bias does not come exclusively from data inputs. The second reason is that I believe that the standard is not necessarily technically feasible in many instances. And third, that this mandate may conflict with privacy and fairness preserving technologies. I will try to give some more information with respect to these three ideas, and with this, I will close my intervention in this point. So with respect to the first reason, we need to consider sources of bias that are across the AI system lifecycle, instead of only focusing on the data that are coming at the beginning of this lifecycle. Bias in data sets could certainly be a problem, and one that can be addressed in part through thoughtful data collection and curation practices. However, bias in AI systems does not come exclusively from bias or incomplete data. For example, we may have data that could be perfectly accurate and representative, but reflect structural and societal biases. And therefore, we are not going to achieve the goal that we are looking for. We may also have AI developers who could make assumptions during the design of the systems on how they expect the systems to be used. And as a result, the system may exhibit bias as well. So to put all the eggs, let's say, on the basket of one single element that intervenes in how bias could actually be surfaced, this is something that I think we should be looking at something with a broader perspective. The second reason was that the standard maybe not be technically feasible in all respects. And let me give some examples. In supervised learning, models are typically trained on pieces of data that are individually labeled by human annotators. And this introduces two forms of potential error. So even if there is a clear agreement on what the label for any given element should be, human annotators will make mistakes, particularly when trying to efficiently label hundreds of thousands of items. But even if this kind of human error in annotation could be eliminated, we cannot eliminate the fact that in many cases there is no clearly a correct label. It's not the same thing to say, label whether this is a cat or not a cat, or whether this is hate speech or is not hate speech. Because the elements that needs to be taken into account in order to make an assessment of hate speech are more difficult than just to identify whether a shape is a cat or not a cat in my example. The problem with the requirement of the error-free and complete could be even more acute for unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is a labor-intensive process that is functionally limited by the capacity of human labelers to apply the correct, if possible, labels to each element in the set. Although this works for smaller data sets, it cannot scale to large data sets or where accurate labels are not existent or hard to find. If we think of training a language model, for instance, we might use billions of examples of written language, far more than human annotators can possibly provide. And that data might contain typos, might contain poor grammar, might contain other kinds of errors. But given enough data, the model may still learn the correct spelling and grammatical structure of a language. So if the AI Act foreclosed the use of imperfect data sets, this will de facto prohibit the use of unsupervised learning, which will be a significant impediment to AI innovation. And the third thing, with respect to the fact that this standard may limit the use of privacy and fairness enhancing tools. I think that in the presentation, you mentioned synthetic data, or one of you mentioned synthetic data. Well, I don't believe that this is going to work, at least in my interpretation of what could be error-free or complete data, because synthetic data are actually not real. Therefore, they could be considered that these are an error. And when we think about privacy enhanced technologies, so differential privacy, actually what we are doing when doing this is introducing noise, introducing errors on purpose in order to provide privacy protections, but actually the data set is definitely not error-free. It is error-filled on purpose in order to provide privacy protection without undermining the scientific value of the data. I've seen that certain member states have already been trying to address this. Some of them have been mentioning reliable data sets to replace the error-free thing, or others to the extent possible. I don't know what could be the perfect wording for this, but I definitely think that we have some room to think about this a bit further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you. We will move now to Elena, since the time is running fast, and I fear that we won't be able to address all the topics. They are quite complex, so it normally takes time to explain them. So, okay, Elena, I think that you go into Article 13 on transparency, which happened to be the same Article 13 in the GDPR that also addresses transparency. So I guess that you will be looking at how the two fit together.
Thanks, Rosa, and thank you for having me. I'm very impressed with all the really intelligent remarks and deep knowledge that I'm seeing. So just for everybody, I'm the DPO in MasterCard and responsible for global privacy compliance assurance, Senior Vice President. And so I think I'm probably the practical guy on the call here. because my thinking is how am I actually, as a DPO, going to make this happen? So first to say, we really welcome this act. We have been supporting it. We think that it's well done. The risk-based approach is the right way to go. And it reminds me of the negotiations on GDPR, where we had such a difficulty in imposing the risk-based approach. And Hilke may remember that. But then finally, you know, it was accepted. So I'm really happy to see that. I'm also happy to see, you know, no requirements in respect of particular legal basis. So you need to have consent, or you need to have this, or you need to have that. I'm really happy that we can count on the GDPR for those pieces. I would also say that we have an AI governance process in place, which is, you know, really working well. And we also have specialized privacy attorneys. So we have privacy attorneys that actually are specialized in AI, because I think that is needed. And that is also then pointing to the difficulty. How can a 1 man or 2 women or 3, you know, people privacy team actually do this properly? So then if we look a little bit further into the transparency requirements. So I think most of us know Article 13 and Article 14 GDPR. For those who, you know, are not daily working on how privacy statements should look like, Article 13 and 14 in itself are a huge, big struggle. Okay, to write a proper privacy notice, taking into account all the guidance that is out there, taking into account the recent cases, the Google case, for example, WhatsApp case. It is really difficult to do it right. And always you need to balance, okay, what words should I use? How, you know, where should I put it? What can I put out? What kind of layer should I put in? So just to create some understanding for everybody that is not an easy job. Now we have additional transparency requirements in the AI Act. And I would say they are on different levels. So if you look at the AI Act, how I look at it is we have systems that have unacceptable risks. So they are prohibited with some exceptions. Then we have high risk systems. Then we have systems that create transparency risks. And then we have systems that do not create particular risk and where the GDPR actually mainly applies. Now, if you look at the systems that create transparency risk, that's Article 52. And you see that is really about making sure that people understand that they're actually speaking with a bot or that they are interacting with AI. It's a very basic thing. Or making sure that everybody understands that this is synthetic images or this is a synthetic voice, that this is not real. And I think that is more like, you know, when a call is recorded, you know, you get this message, hey, this call is recorded. Hey, you know, make sure that you understand this is the article. Makes sense. The second level really is the high risk systems. Now, I think people may believe that, you know, that will never happen or that will not be very likely. But unfortunately, I think that the definitions for high risk AI systems are really broad. And I'm just pointing to the fact that we're looking at biometric identification, and we may get back to that, but no, biometric identification or authentication is happening in a lot of places. When you're using your payment account, when there's some fraud scoring being done, all of that, you know, is very often behavioral biometrics. So that bucket is quite large. So when we're speaking about high risk AI systems, first of all, there's the Article 11 requirement is that, you know, you need to provide a technical description. Now, I've been looking at that, and really the thing that came up to my mind is like, it's a prescription, you know, so you get some pharmaceutical product, you need to take nose drops or you know, paracetamol or whatever, and you have this prescription, and it goes on and on and on and on. And of course, you know, you read it when you have questions, but frankly, you never really look at it. So for me, that's the technical description. Now note that there's the possibility of delegated acts from the Commission. And so that thing is really important to understand. Then we have Article 13, which also has a lot of categories in it. And now if you think, for example, of testing creditworthiness, which is a high-risk AI system, it, for example, requires that the characteristics of the system are explained, but also things like how it would behave with respect to certain groups. So that's important, but it's still tricky as well, because when you're testing creditworthiness, MasterCard's not doing that, but you want to test how creditworthy somebody is. And so if you explain what kind of answers you are expecting so that there's a proper score coming out, then you are actually interfering with the system. So of course, we need to be clear about how a system behaves towards certain groups, but it should not allow for the system to be abused. And the same thing applies, for example, for using AI tools for fraud prevention. And you don't want to provide the information that actually allows criminals to trick the system. So I would say the transparency requirements really also need to be looked at through the lens of a specific use case, as we are today also doing for GDPR. So it's a difficult area. It's not like, okay, we'll do this tomorrow. It really needs thinking, and I believe that the complexity of this will not make it easier, both for individuals to understand, but also for companies that do not have 40 people privacy team like we have. It will make it really complex for them. Then if we move, Rosa, to the risk assessment. So of course, here you have the DPO speaking. That's also something I do every day. And DPIAs and privacy assessments are critical pieces of proper privacy by design and accountability, of course. So I think we need to look at it from different levels. So you would have your typical AI governance process, which companies who seriously look at AI have in place. And as part thereof, you will have the privacy review, which could be a data protection impact assessment, based on Article 24 and 25 and 35. Now, as part of that privacy review, you would have to do a fairness review, because we know under the GDPR, any processing of personal data needs to be fair, so you'll do a fairness review. And I agree with what Cecilia said. Fairness, this test is required under the GDPR, so even if the AI Act wouldn't say anything about it, when there's PI involved, which very often is the case because this is such a broad category, you need to look at fairness. So it means you're looking at data accuracy, you're looking at statistical accuracy, you're looking at bias in the data, but you're also looking at, is there bias in the model? You're also looking at, is there individual fairness? How is this equally treating individuals? You're looking at group fairness, and I think Cecilia referred to it. Are specific groups treated differently, and is that actually fair? Because sometimes, that's what you want to achieve. You want to, you want to provide credit to the people that should get credit, and you don't want to provide credit to the people that are high risk. So group fairness, can be reasonable or it can be unreasonable. And then there's procedural fairness. If somebody disagrees or wants to understand how it works or asks for their data to be deleted or wants to opt out, is that procedural fairness in place? So I think the review under the GDPR in respect of fairness itself is a very comprehensive review. And that's at least how I am looking at it from a perspective of the DPO. That's what I'm requiring. And then if we look further into the AI Act, there's a couple of things. So we have the requirements around the risk management system in Article 9, which is about identification, analysis, and testing. Now, for those who work in the financial industry, we all know that we have risk management procedures in place. Now, we have our risk committees, we have our AI council, we have our risk management frameworks, etc. So that will already be quite hard to put this Article 9 requirement within our risk management systems and then align that with the privacy review. And then on top of that, we have the quality management requirements that are in Article 17. So we'll have to link the quality management requirements with the risk management systems in Article 9, with the GDPR review, including fairness, and then in our global risk management framework. I think we can do it. I can do it, but it's not an easy exercise. And then perhaps a last point on this is that I saw I learned that in the French work around this, we are seeing added some requirements around data minimization, and that would be important to assess the risk. And we all know that that is a very difficult conversation around data minimization and AI, but also very important. So I think if we look at that from a data protection perspective, data minimization is key, but AI gives it a different flavor to that data minimization requirement. So that is a topic I know will immediately come up when we look at, risk assessments and AI. But let me stop here, Rosa, because I know you may want to have other people chime in.
I was thinking when you were talking that the role of the DPO and in your case will not be easier with the AI. So you will give more. But maybe before Jordanka has to leave, maybe it will be good now to move to the set round of questions and to ask Jordanka just to maybe summarize the proposal rules on the competent authorities. You already mentioned it, Jordanka, and the European Artificial Intelligence Board, and then have Hilke giving your comments, the one that Anna started. So you could complement.
Yes, okay, thank you, Rosa. So, on the terms of governance, as mentioned before, we are empowering mainly national authorities, and we leave freedom to member states to designate the most competent authorities within their own organizational structures to be responsible for that legislation. So we're building also here on the existing market surveillance regulation. So we have a lot of powers that those authorities will have, and they can stop, withdraw the product from the market. They can do a lot of checks. Then we also have, as mentioned before, we'll have a mechanism for cooperation between those authorities that are designated at national level, also with other relevant authorities for fundamental rights protections, here also covering in any case the data protection authorities. And at European level, there is also the proposal to create an EU AI board, which should be composed of the national supervisory authorities that are a bit the contact point really at national level, and then also with the Commission and the EDPS, which will be the competent authority for the EU institutions. And that should really be the structure which helps us to have this consistent implementation, and they'll have a key role also to play in the uniform implementation of the act. So I stop here because I think we're already a lot of late, and I'm sure Hilke will have much more to say on that.
Okay, Hilke.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here at the end of the show. I heard enormously interesting stuff. I think the most easy thing was mentioned by Helena, just mentioning this is a difficult area, she said at a certain moment. Yes, that's the understatement of the day, I presume. It's extremely difficult. I'm very happy that I'm allowed to intervene here. And not only I hope to preserve some of a gender balance, but I'm very happy to be here and play this role and be here with you. I am doing enforcement for the Belgian DPA, and I was asked to talk about enforcement, which I think is very useful, which I find very helpful. What I fear when I read AI, the AI regulation, etc., is that we are not doing what we should do, namely is to ensure consistent enforcement, but that this goes towards more fragmentation. That's a bit to be the answer maybe to what Jordanka said, and I think it's all well set up. There's nothing wrong with that. But as an authority, I thought we are going towards fragmentation instead of building one strong digital supervisor, because that could have also be the case. And building maybe on DPAs. DPAs cannot do this just by nothing, but they should be reinforced and take different perspectives. But there's so much overlap between the work that needs to be done, between the knowledge which is needed, at least knowledge we don't have probably, but we should have in the future. So I think that would be my claim. Also the fact that, my claim, I'm not doing any claim here, I'm just a honest person doing in a small member state of Europe something of enforcement. So, but what I would like to say furthermore is also creating, for instance, on top of the EDPB and all kinds of other networks, a new board, which halfly consists probably of the same person as the European Data Protection Board, create a new EU AI board. It on one hand creates confusion, because I think the AI board, contrary to what the EDPB has, is mainly an advisory body and doesn't have any enforcement powers or no enforcement role, if I understand it well, but maybe I'm mistaken. So this is a bit my criticism and also my take, which I had. I think we want comprehensive regulation, and I think that's very well. There's so much good in this proposal, so that's not one angle, but with comprehensive regulation, maybe we should also have a comprehensive regulator. And I think when I read the proposal, but I'm not speaking in name of anyone, only in name of myself here, I think the proposal on the one hand gives this role to the EDPS, but it doesn't go one step further by giving this role to the EDPS for the European level, also for the national level. I think it would make sense to do the same. A remark made by Anna on the legal basis. I think it's very good that it is precise, it is specified that Article 16 is a legal basis, but it's also specified it's only a legal basis for a very limited activity, namely biometric identification in public spaces for law enforcement. That's what I read in the proposal. I think there's many more areas where there is an interference with data processing. We have been discussing a lot of issues where there is clearly an interference with data processing. We talked about data minimization when it was also maybe Article 22 of the GDPR, which relates to human intervention. A lot of it is linked or maybe is dealing with data processing. So I think the question is whether or not the specification is wide enough. Just some comments on this, but I think there's a lot of good work in this proposal. Also, I think in terms of possibilities to supervise, we should develop, and I think that's a task we have as data protection regulators. We should develop ways to ensure possible supervision in a smart and good way, because we already know that what we are doing is extremely difficult. We have a cooperation mechanism, the one-stop shop mechanism, which is much under attack in the public sphere, at least. we were discussing this last week within the EDPB and really with the focus to see how we as regulators can work towards a system which works. And I think this one-stop shop mechanism is something that is not something to throw away directly. So I find it also a missed chance, but that's my last missed chance I will mention, not to criticize the Commission too much, but that this one-stop shop mechanism is not mentioned or taken on board in this new regulation. Although I very well know that there's much criticism to be made on it, etc. What else would I like to say? When I talked about one regulator, I also think that the point Cecilia made is a good one, saying, well, we don't want ne bis in idem. That's for companies important. We need to have not for the same things being dealing with all kinds of different regulators. That's really something which is really an issue, I think, where we should find ways in any case to ensure that even if there's not one regulator, these regulators should work together and should be obliged to work together in an aligned manner. Furthermore, I think just a few things to add to round up. I think that was a point Anna made. The point made on the different terminology. That's something I think that makes life, and I think most of you will agree, makes life extremely difficult. By not using the same terminology, you bring yourself into a lot of let's say of issues of complexities which are not necessarily needed. I think we already see this when we now have to apply the e-privacy directive at the moment still next to the GDPR, that there is, it's not, let's say the alignment is not there and the terminology isn't there. Not even talking about things like transparency, etc. I think I don't want to use much more of your time. What I find in any case, that's my last point, I think, which is extremely important, and that's what I've really love about this regulation, is the importance given to human oversight, a human role in AI. I think that's something which we really should think of as keep, and it is really a strong point. The other points are, there's much to say about it, but I'm happy to say more. But I think I give the floor back to Rosa, because I thought the program is still quite long and the time very limited.
You are right, Hilke. We have 10 minutes and we had planned like for 40 minutes. So we need to shrink the intervention, sorry. So just a few, we will continue with the program, but if you could really limit it to the essential. So we are now on the round of round 4, biometric in public space. And there is a question for Anna Bukta, which actually relates to the categorization of individuals from biometrics into clusters, using ethnicity and other sensitive data or special categories. So just a few words on this point, and then so I will comment. And then second, Cornelia, Microsoft has some thoughts on how to further enhance privacy and fundamental rights when biometric is used in real-time remote biometric identification system. So very briefly, you could just give a hint, and then Anna, sorry, Laura, we jumped you because you had some ideas about transparency. So if the three of you could intervene on these 3 points. Thank you.
Trying to unmute myself, as it always happens that there is an issue. Anyway, thank you, Rosa. I will try to be extremely brief. On your specific question about the categorization, but more broadly, if you allow me, on biometrics in public spaces, and in particular this remote identification in public spaces, I think some of you may know the joint opinion EDPS, EDPB, we have asked for a ban. The reasons are slightly different for both. I think specifically for this kind of, again, remote, seamless categorization of individuals according to criteria which are inherently discriminatory. Many of them are listed in Article 21 of the Charter with the prohibition of discrimination. We thought, based on our knowledge and understanding, that there are no uses where the scientific validity of the technology would be sufficiently proven at this point in time. And in other cases, we felt that they are actually in a direct conflict with the values that the EU should stand for. And for the remote identification in public spaces, again, I would like to underline this element. I think the reasons were first and foremost to launch a proper societal debate, which I think is slowly coming, at least between the regulators, I think between the member states and the parliament. In the parliament, it's certainly already happening. So this is certainly something that we see with positive eyes already having these discussions. But again, more fundamentally, both situations, both possible uses for us are about more than simply protecting personal data. And this is where I think we need to look slightly more broadly than Article 16 and the GDPR. We know that the fundamental right to data protection is largely procedural, but it's also enabling, which is why that, the GDPR does not really have strong prohibitions. I think Jordanka believed that at least some uses would be prohibited based on Article 9, but the rich case law that we have and regulatory practice in several member states on use of biometric identification shows that the picture is much more nuanced. However, there are other fundamental rights. There is the fundamental right to dignity. It is also protected by at the constitutional level in many, if not all, member states. There is also the fundamental right to privacy. And we would argue that, certain these kind of uses and applications actually come very close to almost touching on the essence, if not invalidating those fundamental rights. So this is where we would, at this stage, like to draw a red line in the EU. Voila.
So Cornelia.
Sure, I can go next, Rosa, and thanks for this opportunity. And I think what Anna just said, I think, is the fundamental question. Is this, according to the Human Rights Charter, infringing the core of the fundamental right of privacy in the public space? I think that is where positions might differ. Ultimately, it will have to be the European Court that will make this distinction at one point. Where we were coming from is really looking at in particular South Wales judgments. In the specific case, the use of the use of facial recognition technology was not allowed ultimately. But what is interesting of the case is really the detailed analysis of the court according to the charter in the context of privacy and in the context of looking at the proportionality, the necessity, and the safeguards in the case. And that is sort of where we came down to portamentalize. So we thought that the Commission's approach in a general prohibitions with certain exceptions made sense to me. And we were looking at whether the exemptions in the context of the safeguards were significant enough. And that is where we proposed additional safeguards that we felt would be needed in the case. So we we suggested to further limiting the types of crimes. Note that I think in the council this is seen slightly different. The prior authorization by a judicial authorization, and then really providing much greater transparency, accountability, and public scrutiny in the context of the use to ensure and maintain trust, and also really have this democratic scrutiny. So including accountability reporting, transparency reporting of judicial authorizations, and creating eventually even additional fundamental rights protections in this space. Obviously, I agree with Anna that this all requires more intense debate. But I also wanted to put it in context. It is sort of when you have in certain specific situations, the use of the remote facial recognition technology is efficient instead of having hundreds of police officers screening CCTV camera footage. So I think the scenarios need to be clear. It's when it is limited, but the safeguards need to be there. And then, of course, what we do not know is whether ultimately a court would consider this differently. I personally think for everybody who's in that discussion, the reading of the South Wales judgments are really instructive of the types of safeguards that someone should have in mind. Eventually, what is also interesting is the Washington state law in the United States that has actually adopted specifically legislation for that, also very instructive around accountability. We don't have that in Europe much, that we see these type of transparency reports from law enforcement, but that could help to bring in some safeguards. Just a couple of thoughts. And we'll be really curious how this discussion is going forward.
I'll just jump in. Yes. So just going back quickly on transparency, two things we wanted to raise. The first is that we think that transparency obligations should be combined with the much broader framework for ethical AI. And we think, this is an opportunity. This regulation could be an opportunity to basically create the right incentives for companies to build upfront trustworthy AI through ethics by design frameworks. And therefore, so rather than going to extremely broad and detailed disclosure or one-size-fits-all requirements about AI systems, this alternative approach, and complementary approach could create a common trustworthy AI framework so that citizens basically would know how their data are used in the context of AI on the basis of common and solid foundations, basically. And then looking at the specific transparency requirements for certain AI systems in the Act, the requirements are quite broad. We think the focus should be on making sure, of course, that users understand why a certain AI system is being deployed, so the purpose for which it's being used, and how the system could impact them. So trying to explain what type of impact and outcome could be produced. But then we also think that whatever goes beyond that, and this could include detailed explanation about the workings of systems, would easily become unmanageable for the companies, given the complexity and fast-paced evolution of AI systems. And then at the same time could really create an overflow of information for users, which would not always be in a position to process that information, and also ultimately could also degrade the quality of the services they're receiving. So we think these two so transparency specific, transparency disclosure, and a much broader framework should go hand in hand. And we think, this debate around the AI regulation, it's a good opportunity to explore and perhaps strengthen even further the basically information for users through through transparency. I tried to be very quick. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, that was very concise and quick. Actually, we have now two rounds of questions, and I am minded to skip the 5 and go to seats, just because the seats, we have not addressed it at all. Whether 5, we have somehow talked about it. So that we are basically finished. The time should finish, but if we could just have 5 minutes more. So this is about sandboxes, and I thought it would, since it's completely new and we haven't discussed it, so I thought that maybe it will be good to hear from Cecilia and from Hilke about how you see the proposal rules on sandboxes. There is an encouragement to use sandboxes. There is as we discussed before, legal grounds for use of data for sandboxes, so specific in the proposal. So if you have any comments, I think it could be interesting, because there's a new concept after all. I think in EU legislation, I don't think we have seen it before.
Very good. So I will go and try to be quick, taking into account the time. So we are pleased to see that there are recognition in the legislation with respect to other ways in which we can be innovative as well. And I think that the conversation of today and many others around AI shows the need of cooperation and dialogue between those who are actually involved in how we do this. And these are, of course, the authorities from the different angles in which they have the expertise, and also with respect to the organizations. But if we want to be successful in having this kind of tools for cooperation, we need, I think, to do something more than just name sandbox. We need to create the environment for organizations to feel that this is something attractive, in the sense that to a certain extent, a sandbox or other kind, let's say, of experimentation places, to a certain extent, organizations are being showing also their weaknesses and also things that they are just starting to think about, and that's why it is an experimental place. And therefore we need to be more clear, organizations, of the benefits that you get for going there, with respect to liability, with respect to confidentiality, and also with respect to how this is going to feedback in the process, because the whole thing of having sandbox or other kind of innovative similar initiatives in a regulation is actually that what you obtain from there is actually reverting for the benefit of the legislative regulatory landscape. And this is also something that we are not yet seeing in the proposal of regulation, and probably we have time in the legislative process to improve of how we make real that the sandboxes or other kind of similar innovative, and I'm thinking also of policy prototyping, and we have examples at Meta that we have been starting for more than a year now, which is the open loop programs, which are public. And we started with actually an ADAIA, which was an AI impact assessment. Now we're moving to explainability on AI. So we are really trying to offer other kind of spaces in which we have academics, with organizations of different sizes, actually with startups in Europe, and of course regulators as well. But for this, let's say, to be a reality in a legislation, we need to have more things with respect to the benefits and the protections that we have, and how these feedback into the legislative process. Thank you.
Hilke, reactions or thoughts?
Trying to unmute. Sandbox is a topic I remember talking a lot about in my former job when I worked for Schiphol. I think it's in itself a very promising tool. It's also very complicated and tool which requires a lot of thinking. It's in that respect I fully agree with Cecilia. It is a way forward to see how innovation can go hand in hand with protection. I think it's really very impressive, a very good, a very promising tool. But we also have to realize that we cannot have too many sandboxes. It's for both parties. It's a very complex complex issue to deal with. But I'm very happy that at least at this point the AI regulation ensures involvement also of data protection authorities and also the link with the DPIA, etc. But I think in itself it's good that there is an opening in the legislation to do this, an encouragement in the legislation, and indeed, if we can work together in more clear terms under what conditions we should do it, it's a complex thing, but I think it's a useful way forward in a rapidly changing digital environment. I think we need indeed innovative tools, and this is one which we should work on. I know the ICO is doing it, and there's different experiences already, and we should build on that. And I think it's in itself, these are tools which are useful, which are difficult to put in place. Like at the moment, the certification on the GDPR, for instance, is something also it's something which is slowly, but very slowly developing. So we should definitely, I'm all for it, but we should do it in a way realizing that it's not so easy to make it in practice. I think that's what I could say about this. And I'm very happy to have been here in this discussion.
Thank you. I think that we are now already 6 minutes beyond the time. So I just wanted to thank you, all the speakers. It has been extremely interesting. I think it has shown the word complexity that Hilke used. I think is very accurate to describe this topic, which means that there could be also many other occasions for continuing the discussion. So thank you to all the speakers for the participation, and to everybody who had been here listening. And thank you again. So I hope you have enjoyed it as I have and learned quite a lot. So thank you, and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, and thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.